I'm really excited to introduce this panel because it's a continuation of a really important discussion that was started last year. We had a wonderful panel discussion that Sue Minter, who's director of Capstone Community Action, was part of alongside Virginie Diembu from CVOEO and Senator Kesharam Hinsdale, who I think is here, I hope is here. But last year we were talking about the possibility of an environmental justice bill in Vermont and what that would look like. And so now, a year later, that bill has passed, and so now we get the opportunity to have a moderated panel thanks to Claire McElveny from the Public Service Department. I did not appropriately introduce Claire's title, which is a very exciting and important one. So Claire serves as the Data and Equity Policy Manager at the Public Service Department. And so Claire is going to moderate a discussion with Sue again this year. Thank you, Sue, for coming back and for your leadership at Capstone and on the Just Transitions Subcommittee of the Climate Council. And with Carla Raymondi, who is the Civil Rights and Environmental Justice Director at the Agency of Natural Resources, who has a lot of the responsibility and opportunity to help move forward the implementation of that environmental justice bill with other folks. So with that, thank you all for joining, and I'm going to turn it over to Claire. I think we will do the same with Slido, right? If folks have questions throughout, if it comes up, write it in, upvote it, and then Claire will be able to see that.
All right. Hi, everyone. Again, it's nice to still be up here, seeing so many people in person after never meeting many of you except for in Zoom. So I'm just going to give a quick introduction to our panel and then hopefully turn most of the talking over to Carla and Sue. But I think Jared's reflection on sort of where we were last year at the summit in really an exploratory phase tees up well where we are now in terms of having taken some steps forward in terms of environmental justice and energy and climate work with, as Jared mentioned, the passage of the Environmental Justice Bill, which is now our first establishes our first environmental justice state policy, and also the release of our Climate Action Plan and the updated Comprehensive Energy Plan, which are both guided by and reference really important principles established by the Just Transition Subcommittee of the Climate Council. And tying these two really important pieces of work together is the fact that our environmental justice law actually references those guiding principles as something that the Environmental Justice Advisory Council and the Interagency Environmental Justice Committee, two bodies established by that law, must think about and consider as we weave environmental justice principles into our state policy and programs. So without much further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Carla, who's the Civil Rights and Environmental Justice Director at the Agency of Natural Resources, to give a little bit of an overview of what actually is in the environmental justice law, and then talk about how the Agency of Natural Resources is beginning to think about implementing that. And then we're going to turn it over to Sue, who is the Executive Director of Capstone Community Action and an appointed member of the Climate Council and has been serving as the co-chair of the Just Transition Subcommittee to talk about what that subcommittee is doing now that the Climate Action Plan has passed and to make sure that we're honoring those guiding principles in the implementation phase. So as Jared mentioned, we're going to have a little bit of presentation from our speakers. We'll do some moderated Q&A through Slido, so please remember to put your questions there, and then we're actually going to, at the end, for about, I think, 10 to 15 minutes, sort of break from our panel and do some sort of just discussion at our tables with some prompt questions to think about how we're beginning to actually implement environmental justice in our own work outside the council and the state agencies. So with that, I'll turn it over to Carla.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Hi. I'm Carla Raymondi, and I am the Director for Civil Rights and Environmental Justice for the Agency of Natural Resources. My unit sits with the Secretary's office, so that's the central office. And within the agency, there are 3 departments: the Department of Environmental Conservation, Forest Parks and Recreation, and Fish and Wildlife. And so my responsibility is to create a comprehensive civil rights and environmental justice program to be embedded in the programs of the 3 departments. Thank you very much for having me, and I hope this presentation is helpful. So, as previously indicated, I'm going to provide a brief overview of the legislation as it actually was approved. And then I'm going to go to share with you what the agency has been doing to prepare for the implementation of this bill, which is a heavy lift, but very much needed and appreciated. Okay, so then this is a brief overview of the Act. We have the findings, which is a very lengthy section. Unlike other environmental justice bills from other states, ours is very robust, robustly based on facts that have been identified and included in this section. Section 2, we have the purpose, the definitions. There is an environmental justice state policy that was adopted as part of this particular legislation. And then there are guidance and some requirements for implementing of the state policy. Then there's rulemaking that the Agency of Natural Resources will have to undergo. And then there's the creation of 2 working committees, which is an incredible dynamic and something that Sue perhaps can later talk about as we talk about the just transition. And how these 2 committees will help us do that effectively. And then the EJ mapping tool. So we can go down. So the purpose of the bill is to identify, reduce, and eliminate environmental health disparities to improve the health and well-being of all Vermont residents. This is a broad statement of purpose, but incredibly effective. And so I'm just going to scroll over some of the definitions for everyone's benefit. There's this really comprehensive definition of environmental justice, and I'm just going to highlight that there is an inclusion of equitable access to and of the distribution of environmental benefits and burdens, which is really fundamental as we think about how different programs within different agencies are actually going to implement and deliver on the requirements of this bill. It's not only looking at the burdens, it's also looking at an equitable distribution of environmental benefits, which is many times overlooked in this area of work. And so we go then to the definition of environmental justice focused population. It's defined as, in the block group, the annual median household income is not more than 80% of the state MHI. Persons of color and indigenous peoples comprise at least 6% or more of the population, or at least 1% or more of households have limited English proficiency. This definition was gathered through an inclusive community engagement process, and it reflects those conversations. And then limited English proficiency is at the cornerstone of civil rights compliance and environmental justice initiatives. And so it's particularly important for us at the state level to make sure that in order for us to deliver effectively and efficiently our products, that we are doing so equitably throughout the population, disregarding or overcoming perhaps burdens on communication. And so environmental benefits, there's a definition of environmental benefits, which I think it's really helpful as we think about how agency work impacts certain communities. I think it's a great it's a great guidance to have a sense of what those environmental benefits are: open spaces, access to green areas, water that's clean, drinkable, playgrounds, recreational activities, and so on. And so then environmental burdens, and this is an important aspect of the bill, because there's a requirement to identify cumulative burdens. And so this definition is at the core of that process. And meaningful participation. And I'm gonna focus on this as the Agency of Natural Resources. We have been really focusing on providing meaningful access to all Vermonters. So I'm gonna lay out how we're doing that. And so this is the Vermont state policy. It is the policy of the state of Vermont that no segment of the population of the state should, because of its racial, cultural, or economic makeup, bear a disproportionate share of environmental burdens or be denied an equitable share of environmental benefits. I just really like to read that first paragraph. I think it's really powerful and really important that we're all aware of what's at the core of this particular bill. It is further the policy of the state of Vermont to provide the opportunity for the meaningful participation. And meaningful participation is a term of art that's been imbued with a lot of meaning and processes. Of all individuals, with particular attention to environmental justice-focused populations, those individuals who have been marginalized, structurally alienated, and not actively engaged in decision-making processes, in the development, implementation, or enforcement of any law, regulation, or policy. And I think this is a fantastic reminder, and this is something that I just have a hard copy of on my desk. I really think it's something that we should just go back to, just to make sure that we're really clear about what it is that we're all trying to achieve when we talk about environmental justice and this particular bill. And so now to the nitty-gritty of the bill. And so the bill includes 10 agencies that are covered. And then it also includes the Office of the Executive Director of the Office of Racial Equity. And so the agencies are ANR, the Agency of Transportation, the Agency of Commerce and Community Development, Agriculture, Education, Public Utility Commission, NRB, the Department of Health, Public Safety, and Public Service. And so the implementation of that EJ state policy that I read previously compels us to do 3 things. Create and adopt community engagement plans, and this applies to the covered agencies. Direct investments with environmental benefits proportionately to environmental justice-focused populations. And number 3, consider cumulative environmental burdens and access to environmental benefits, which is at the core of that particular purpose statement that we were talking about earlier. And so these are the 3 areas that agency action would have to develop more of. And so the Agency of Natural Resources will have to undergo rulemaking and with regards to cumulative environmental burdens, the implementation and consideration of cumulative environmental burdens within the agency, a definition of what that is, and then inform how the public and the covered agencies implement the consideration of cumulative burdens and the use and development and maintaining of a mapping tool. And so this is where this conversation, I think, will be centered on, and is that this legislation creates 2 bodies that are going to inform the processes outlined before. And so it's the EJ Advisory Council and the Interagency Committee. What I really appreciate about the Interagency committee is that it is the goal, as I see it, for these agencies, the covered agencies that I highlighted earlier, that we communicate meaningfully and develop a working program, a work plan to implement and be able to deliver effectively on what's required under this bill. And then the advisory council will bring in what's most important in this whole process is community input, community feedback, just to make sure that as we, the agency, develop programs and try to advance equity in our work, we're actually doing so in a way that's responsive of the actual needs of community members. And so these two committees are going to be at the heart of implementation of this bill. And then this is the mapping tool that ANR is tasked with developing. But also, I anticipate that this process will include and must include meaningful engagement from community members. And so with all of that, I'm just now going to focus on the things that the agency has been doing in order to prepare to be able to deliver effectively and efficiently on what's required under this bill. So as feedback, I joined the agency a year and 2 months ago, in a part-time capacity. So for 20 hours for a year, and then 2 months ago I became full-time. So now I'm like actually being able to to do most of it in the way that I really wanted to. So we've worked on a notice of non-discrimination, and so this area really, and I think this is very important for us to consider, is that there's an overlap between civil rights and environmental justice. And if we think about civil rights as the foundational principles and as the vessel, the container that's going to allow us to really deliver on environmental justice principles, then we can sort of like better understand the relationship between some of the requirements under civil rights and some of the initiatives under environmental justice. And at the core of these two sets of regulations is meaningful participation. But then, you know, the Agency of Natural Resources identified a non-discrimination coordinator, so moi here, and we developed a language access plan. I am extremely happy to share that this week the language access plan was shared with the public, and we are going beyond what's statutorily required for us to do, and we're engaging community members in 3 sessions to get feedback from those individuals who are going to be most impacted by our language access plan. Our public comment period is going to start in October 18th. And so also, we've developed a grievance procedure, and we're in the process of developing an investigation manual. The focus and priority on these 2 spaces has to do with the fact that as the Agency of Natural Resources starts implementing and providing more guarantees and opportunities of engagement to individuals, that we should have a robust process in place to be able to handle any grievance or complaint from these community members. And so another thing that we've worked on is an accessible website, staff training series, data gathering, mapping, and public participation. The Department of Environmental Conservation is engaged in a public engagement contract with Rejoice through a partnership. And so 2 things we tackled. We sort of like revisited staff and realigned staff, and so we created a civil rights working group that sits with the Secretary's office, and that group identifies priorities for the agency. And then there are 2 groups that are actively engaged in training right now for civil rights and environmental justice, and those are the civil rights and environmental justice liaisons. So within the Department of Environmental Conservation, our biggest department that has most of the permitting and rulemaking within it, there's a liaison. There's a liaison that has been identified for every single unit within that department. And so the idea is to train these individuals on the principles of environmental justice, of the content of this particular legislation, civil rights, so that when we're ready to programmatically embed environmental justice principles into the work of the agency, these individuals are going to be like the first point of contact for staff people within the agency. And so we did the same with civil rights. So we have two groups that are being trained actively on those areas of work. And so then we're also creating an environmental justice and civil rights civil rights unit. Also, we developed our Notice of Non-Discrimination, which includes limited English proficiency. Oh, I'm going the other way. And so with regards to the meaningful engagement aspect of it, I thought it was very important that we work directly with the law enforcement arm of the agency first. And so we prioritized training those individuals, the environmental enforcement officers within the Department of Environmental Conservation, and from Fish and Wildlife, the Warden Service. So we've been providing extensive training to these two groups within the agency, and we introduced these I-Speak cards that include flags to also be able to communicate effectively with illiterate individuals when wardens are on the ground or EEOs are on the ground. They can actually provide instantaneous interpretation to those individuals to breach that communications gap. And we also adopted a language access policy. What I am extremely proud of with this particular project and the scope of our language access plan is that we are not only including verbal needs, we're also including individuals who are deaf, hard of hearing, blind, deaf-blind, or have any other communications needs. So we are extending services to all of those individuals within our language access plan. And then lastly, these are the contacts and the individuals that have been identified as primary points of contact for the three departments. Like I said, behind those individuals, there's a team of liaisons who are being trained and readily available to provide feedback and information to our staff. And so that's basically what the Agency of Natural Resources has been doing in this space.
I want to just say, wow, it's so great to be here and see so many people. I also want to say, as one of the few people who raised their hands involved in the discussions so long ago, how cool it is that so many more people than that are now in this and of this network, and how powerful that is. Congratulations, Jared and others. I want to also just sort of acknowledge and thank, in particular, legislators in this room. I think when we talk about the Global Warming Solutions Act and the Environmental Justice Bill, these are transformational advancements for the state of Vermont, and we have to really thank those who have been in the trenches in the legislature. And I can say that as someone who was colleagues, I spent, as my background, I was 10 years in the Agency of Commerce doing community planning and downtown revitalization. Yay for that work. I also served 6 years in the legislature in the Transportation Committee and Appropriations Committee, and then in the executive branch in the Transportation Agency, and also working to follow in the footsteps of Neil Lunderville to try to figure out how do we recover from Tropical Storm Irene, which is really relevant to today. And I just have to just mention what's happening in Pakistan right now, recovering from unbearably terrible flooding, as well as in Puerto Rico. So our thoughts are with those and many, many others struggling with the climate emergency.
Thank you. I'm from Puerto Rico, and I really appreciate the sentiment. Thank you.
You bet. So I now have the amazing privilege of working as the director at Capstone Community Action, which is one of 5 of Vermont's anti-poverty nonprofits that have been working to end poverty since 1965, when the war on poverty was initiated. Unfortunately, the battle rages on. And I want to thank EAN for again focusing on equity as we have this conversation, which generally focuses on those of us with privilege. And I must say, as a white woman of privilege, it's hard to be up here pretending to talk about justice. We did try to get others to do this, but I am continuing to carry the torch until I can hand it to someone who I think is more appropriately carrying it. I also am honored to be a member of the Climate Council. I thank the legislature for recognizing community action as really organizations on the forefront of economic injustice and focusing on how do we address these tremendous disparity, which frankly is so much worse than it was, including worse than before the pandemic. And I have to say, because our work is in dealing with crisis, we are right now, today, this week, very concerned about the emergency rental assistance program's abrupt change, which we believe, with the support of the legislature, may be less abrupt. But just for a moment to realize, here in Washington County, there are 358 people in area hotels, in addition to 40 in shelters, in addition to 60 sleeping outside. Think about that. That's what I can't sleep on. But today, I'm here to talk about why thinking about that is important. And I was so honored to be asked to be a co-chair of the Just Transitions subcommittee of the Climate Council. And I want to again acknowledge that the legislature, in passing the Global Warming Solutions Act, explicitly recognized not only the urgent call to action about our changing climate, but the need to do it in a manner that recognizes this need to redress the social, economic, and racial disparities. And that's why they included this concept of a just transitions. We tried to expand our membership to be more inclusive, to include members of the Black and Indigenous leaders, Latinx leaders, leaders of the labor movement in Vermont, low-income voices, small business voices, and youth voices. So our subcommittee worked very hard to include many voices. I must recognize that I have been a co-chair. I don't see her here, but Sarah Phillips was with me serving in that role. She is the director of the Office of Economic Opportunity. Kaya Morris of Rights and Democracy. Nadia Pops, who had to leave when she had her baby. And now we have Abby. What's Abby's last name? White? Willard. Yes, thank you. Sorry, Abby, she's probably not here. She's busier than I am from the Agency of Agriculture. So now it's she and I trying to be this co-chair. But we have support from Claire, many others on staff to help us. Why is Capstone involved in this? I want to mention that the community action agencies also provide weatherization services for low-income folks, a huge part of our climate agenda, which is thermal, and the recognition, especially by EAN and all of you who have supported these pitches in the past, to scale up our weatherization program, essential to stop, quote, heating the outside, which is what our team reminds me. That's what we do until we weatherize. And we at Capstone expanded the mission to be called Weatherization and Climate Impact. And we're exploring new areas of focus, including transportation. In the work at the Climate Council, what does a just transitions look like? So we try to become educated about what other states have done, but especially to dive into what do we mean by a just transitions. We had many workshops. All of us who had never met before, still haven't met in person, worked really hard and developed what are called the guiding principles to a just transition. And I'm going to just read them briefly, topically. And it starts with having inclusive, transparent, and innovative engagement. You heard about that from Carla Central, and I will come back to that. It's about policies that are accountable and restorative to those folks who have been left behind. It is about supporting workers, families, and communities, protecting jobs, really recognizing that this transition is going to impact people's jobs and planning for that, focusing on the most impacted first, moving at the speed of trust. Really, really hard for people in this room who have to move quickly and who come from a culture of rapid movement to actually step back and take the time needed to create inclusive spaces. And to have solidarity. Solidarity particularly with our indigenous communities and their history. That's super quick, but I wanted to get to it. So we feel that the guiding principles was a really great accomplishment, and they were incorporated into the Climate Action Plan that was passed. They were also included into the EJ bill, which we appreciate so much, actually having statute behind these very important concepts. So what is the role of our Just Transitions Committee now? I did want to just quickly talk about that, and I know we want to break into breakout groups quickly. You can switch to the slide now. We really wanted to focus on equitable engagement, and we have been thinking especially about what the budget needs to be in this next fiscal year. The Climate Council is putting forward a memo to the administration with some of its key recommendations. So our subcommittee has put forward specific recommendations, including dollar amounts that we think need to be included into these certain concepts. Without directly engaging community members and organizations who work with disenfranchised communities, we don't bring them into our conversation. So we believe there has to really be better relationships and support, including financial support, for partner organizations to help bring people into conversations broadly defined. We believe there must be compensation. We can't expect people who don't have enough to pay their rent or buy a car, let alone drive a car, to have the time and bandwidth to engage with us without compensation. And that includes members of our boards. We really want to have training on the guiding principles that we've developed. We have a scoring rubric. We've tried to do that, but the very swift speed with which we had to come up with a climate action plan meant we didn't really move at that speed of trust. We really weren't able to embrace and implement these principles. And they're not simple. They take time and thought and training. We really want to focus on intergenerational engagement and marketing and communications, but not necessarily the kind of amazing high-level work that you see in your report from EAN, but more communication with folks who don't understand why they're getting flooded. They're not actually having the background and time to be thinking about the climate when they are trying to feed their children or flee domestic violence. And yet we know they are disproportionately impacted by all of these changes. So we need to bring them to the table in meaningful ways, including the kind of material that we create that needs to have simple language, and language access and translation is absolutely central. Thank you, Carla, for finally moving this forward statewide. I'm seeing this statewide. The Agency of Transportation has had a civil rights division for a long time, but we were the lone voice, unfortunately, in that area, and state government no longer. I do want to mention, why does engagement matter? Last night, I was at the public meeting about the Clean Car Standard rollout, and thank you to all of the folks who worked incredibly hard to bring more people to the table. And it was an interesting meeting, and what I noticed was when we broke into small groups to talk about, there was a lot of frustration about the state incentives for cars, for our electric vehicles. And the frustration was from a lovely, dedicated, retired couple who have an EV and want to get another one, that they don't qualify, even though they are on Social Security income. And even greater frustration from a car dealer who explains that we have it all wrong because our incentives are based on income. And he believes strongly that we need to be targeting our incentives for the folks who can afford the best EVs out there. So I get it. People who are in this room want a good deal. But people who we're trying to target just need a good car. And I don't know what's more important, but certainly we don't have a response. I appreciate Patrick Murphy's explanation that the legislature is targeting our state incentives to 75% of Vermonters who do meet the income guidelines, rather than the 25% who don't. But I think it is worth asking, what's more important? Accessing the people who don't have cars or can't afford them, or getting more on the road more quickly. That's the point that the gentleman who sells the car was making. I do want to recognize we have a program at Capstone that the community action agencies have started. Sam is here, Mileage Smart, which is about used cars. Thank you, legislators, for supporting the idea that we actually create incentives for people who can't afford new cars but can't afford used cars. And I want to mention that we are trying also to think about mobility access, creating a new program, Community Rides Vermont, a rural Uber of electric vehicles to serve the needs of people who can't afford a car at all. Just wanted to put that in there. Lots we could talk about. I really want to appreciate the tremendous advance that we have already made. It's easy to say what we're not doing, but please recognize how far we have come. It's enormously important that we've passed this, that we have real standards now that we're working very hard to meet. We've got environmental justice. Thank you all for staying with this and advancing the ball. Great.
Sorry, I have a hard time cutting Sue off because I feel like I learn so much every time I hear her speak. So I hope you felt the same. But we do have a couple questions coming in on Slido. One, I think this received a lot of conversation in the legislature while this bill was working its way through. Maybe I'll see, Carla, if you have any insight on this, but the bill was passed with little funding for the Environmental Justice Advisory Council in terms of per diems and stipends. and how can we ensure there's meaningful participation without financial equity. Just wondering if there's any updates on or thinking on that from the agency. And I know we've talked about it in the Just Transition Subcommittee and have put forward that as a budget priority to the council, so for that work.
Yeah, there have been conversations about this at the agency, and it's going to be an ongoing conversation. I really don't have like much specifics about the per diem, but the agency is fully aware and recognizes the importance of paying individuals for their knowledge and their time. But yeah, it's an ongoing conversation that's being had, and hopefully we can land in a place where it's effective for everyone.
Again, we are going to put this as a number to the administration, and whether or not they're able to embrace it, we'll continue the conversation in the legislature. It's difficult, but without paying people, they cannot participate. And when they're not there, their voices are not well understood, because those of us in this room definitely don't know what it's like to live without a car. Many of us, most of us. And food.
Thank you. And while Sue, this one is directed at you, I think we've also had a lot of conversation on it through the Climate Council process, but how do you square moving at the speed of trust in Vermont with our moral obligation to address the global climate crisis as quickly as possible? So welcome any thoughts you have on that.
To me? How do we square? We have to do it all, right? We have to move, and we have to create more space, more opportunities, and this idea of an inclusive space. You know, it's very, very hard when I'm in a meeting and I am very comfortable speaking to make room and to listen instead of speaking. And bringing more people into the room, creating more trust and opportunity, even as we are rapidly making progress and taking action. I don't think they are necessarily exclusive. We have to do both.
Got permission for one more question, and I think this one is a good one to end on. For both our speakers, how will this work translate to increased funding for minority and low-income populations in energy work and technology? So maybe we'll start with Carla, because I know there's some provisions on that.
Yeah, this is a very interesting question, and there are two different ways in which we can answer the question. One is intangible, and the other one is, you know, like a tangible aspect to it, and it's actual dollars being funneled to improve quality of environment, and that's happening, you know, under this bill with the directing of investments into those particular communities. But I do think and also, you know, at the federal level with Justice 40, and that's something that internally the Agency of Natural Resources is actually actively working on. I had a meeting with program staff about how to identify those investments within a particular program structure. So there's really concrete dollars and signs that are going to be directed towards improving environments, lived environments for these particular communities. But the other aspect of the question, which I think is more meaningful in a sense, is the actual engagement with communities and empowerment that comes with paying particular attention to the needs and goals and aspirations of members of these communities. And I think that should be the goal, not only from state government, but for every individual, is to be able to relate to others and engage in meaningful conversations to understand, to better understand that we're all in this and we all want to achieve the same things. And I think what stems from that naturally is the desire to invest and sort of like you're morally compelled once there's an understanding of the deficiencies and the structural burdens that have been placed in certain communities because they are who they are. You know, we are who we are. It's just there's a moral impetus that perhaps could follow. And I think that's where environmental justice really can be really impactful in not only changing how the state behaves, but how we relate to each other as humans.
I think it is really important that we look at investment and where money is going. So I think it's fantastic that we're going to hold our feet to the fire. It's not going to be easy. And then there's the question of how you identify the communities that you're targeting. So the mapping work that we are going to do is hugely important. I think you may know that there's Justice 40 out of the Biden administration. So it's not just Vermont. We're looking at this from a national perspective. So we also have recommendations coming from our Just Transition Subcommittee, recommendations to the Climate Council around what we're calling action opportunities. So providing funding for action by supporting the frontline communities or partners who work with them to actually become agents for change. So we see this as sort of an innovative grant opportunity for action around empowerment. So we have to fund staff in and throughout government on this to keep on it. We have to invest in communities, in training, and in action.
Great, and moderator prerogative, I'll just add, both Carla and Sue mentioned Justice 40, and the Department of Energy did just come out with their guidance on implementation of Justice 40, noting that pretty much all of the programs under the bipartisan infrastructure law and the IRA will be covered and expected to meet certain guidance under that law. So as Sue mentioned, coming both from our state policies and our federal ones. So with that, I think I'm going to pass it off to Kara for further instructions.
Okay, we don't have as much time as we want for this, but it's really important that people take a few minutes to turn to folks at your table and have a brief conversation about what questions or thoughts this EJ panel raised for you, particularly in connection to your work. The bigger tables might want to break into a couple groups. We're only going to spend about 5 minutes on this, and then I'll bring you back together and give you a few more words before lunch, and maybe you can talk more about it over lunch.